Hey, how's it going? My name is Lee. I'm the host for Heavy Art Talk. If this is your first time here, this is a visual arts podcast mostly involving people who do work within the heavy metal scene. It's my honor to have musician, artist John Dyer Baizley joining me today. Hope you enjoy this interview. Thank you. We're talking backstage a little bit. You're going to be going on tour relatively soon.
Yes.
How many dates do you think you're going to be doing? Or I guess that's already determined.
Uh, in terms of what's been announced, we're doing a short little run in May with Red Fang, basically to get us from two festivals that we're both playing, one in Daytona and up to Ohio. So we just decided to join forces and get, I think it's roughly 2 weeks worth of dates there. We've got some announcements coming up, including, I don't know when this airs actually. So by the time it airs, hopefully we will have been announced. But there's going to be a little bit more, another month or two of U.S. touring. In August, we're going to be doing a European run with primarily festivals. This should be pretty fun in August. And then we've got plans congealing for the fall as well. So there's the first half of this year has been extremely dry in terms of our touring schedule, but that has actually given me the opportunity to, by necessity and scarcity of other things to do, it's given me the opportunity to kind of get back into making artwork at a more increased pace and a little bit less Baroness specific in recent months. So that's actually been really nice for me because I essentially, and whether I made sort of an outward decision to stop working so much with band projects, and this was years ago. I just kind of had gotten to the point where it was starting to feel a little routine, and I felt like I was starting my sort of creative, visually creative mind was starting to get a little bored or complacent, and I didn't feel like I didn't feel like I had enough to say to justify working as hard as I had been. So I kind of took a break from that for a while in order to practice and work on technique and do some, sort of artistic and creative investigation, so that when inevitably I would get back to it, that I would feel fresh. And I think that's sort of what's happening. Hopefully, what's happening for me.
I've been seeing like a ton of stuff you've been working on in like that series, the Memento Mori series with the skulls. You got a
Yeah.
couple behind you
Oh
there.
yeah. Some of it's behind me. Yeah. Yeah.
Those have been really inspiring to me because I really love like wet on wet, like loose watercolor techniques, and then
Yeah.
like combining them with like some tighter stuff too. And like it's been really cool to see you do those, man.
Yeah.
I've
I you
quite a
know
bit of them saved on my phone.
it was. I'm trying to think when I started doing this. Maybe 2019.
Mm.
But it certainly picked up during the pandemic when my life was just awful, and I needed something to keep myself you know cheery. And I sort of, because I the first big like serial thing that I've done these called the Frustrating Micron series, where did I did 200 multi hour sketch drawings using microns, which was a medium I saw a lot of my peers and friends using, most of whom are more like illustrator style artists, and I always hated that material. So I decided to do a project where I would just do it until I found something that I liked, and it thousands of hours probably doing those, and then when the pandemic hit, and it was clear that my mental state was in sharp decline, and b, that there was very little else going that was likely to be going on. I decided to initially I just wanted to get more familiar, and I wanted to discover myself as a using watercolors, which I've always sort of considered them not my primary medium. even though almost everything that I'm known for doing is basically watercolor and ink,
Yeah.
I felt like the ink part was what I was comfortable with. The line art was what I was comfortable with. The image making was what I was comfortable with, and the painting was just, had been at that point in my career just what I was doing to just like add color because it was quick and
Yeah.
because I had some experience with it, But I never considered myself a watercolor painter. I didn't know anything about the technique. I didn't really know anything formal with that medium. Which, as if it sounds like you use watercolor,
Yeah.
um, it's one of the few media that I think traditional media that we as artists use that it really does benefit from a little bit of formal know-how.
For sure.
It's you could certainly splash color all over the place, but uh, when I started this project during the pandemic, I was doing lips and I was doing, I don't know, I did all sorts of things. Um, but I just wanted to see if I could. I wanted to understand pigments. I wanted to understand technique. I wanted to work on color composition. I wanted to work on spontaneity, and I eventually began. I eventually fell in love with the wet on wet techniques because they're difficult for me because my brain doesn't quite organize things like that. And I think one of the things that's been a prevalent um, reality for me as an artist is that the more distasteful I find something, the more I choose that as my challenge to
Yeah.
overcome. I don't know. I mean, it's not that I say hate a lot, but I just don't prefer. I wish, in many ways, I wish I was this like beautifully efficient, uh, simple, graphically pure sort of image maker, but I'm not. And so that's all. So all I try to do is create simple, effective, expressive works, and all I create are these dense, layered, like embellishment overloads, and just pounds and pounds and pounds of ink and watercolor and technique and layers and image and figurative imagery just layered on top of one another. But when I go to the museum, I just want to look at Monet. I just want to look at Rembrandt. I just want to, if I'm looking at math, I just want to look at the expressive artists because uh, I I
It's what's
I
not
don't know.
natural. Yeah.
Yeah, it's what's not natural, and it's what I find prevalent in a lot of a lot of the visual work that I deem transcendent. I deem inspirational. It's got a quality that I consider in my own work a weakness. So I think it's actually, I'm kind of running around the point, but I think one very helpful mo that I like to engage in is just to constantly challenge myself. Not I think it's been. I don't know that things would have gone any differently had I not intentionally taken on challenges, had I not intentionally struggled at times with elements of creativity. But I do find that the only creative works that I make are the ones that are born from struggle, whether that's in a self-imposed one, like, for instance, working with watercolor or trying to be loose and expressive, or whether it's the sort of struggle that life has dealt me. Those are that seems to be the impetus for most of my work, and maybe it is for most artists, but um, I'm of an age now where I wish that it came from somewhere a little bit more positive and less difficult at times. But
Yeah. I was curious too. So you're talking about like just the line work of like some of the art that you've done, more in the past and stuff. So instead of using microns, what was your method of doing that then? Were you using like ink brush and just really tight lines?
ink brush, yeah, I use ink brush in the initial stages of inking because it's because it does have life to it.
Hmm.
It does create movement and form in a way that I find much more convincing than more technical media like microns or technical pens or whatever. I'll use ink, like like dip dip pens, crow quills, stuff like that when possible. But ultimately, I end up falling back in line with the technical media because there are what I've come to develop is a way to use technical pens, and I genuinely prefer using like isograph pens. But there's always a micron or two, somewhere in the mix. But with those, the thing that I very much dislike about them is the consistency of the line, which is what they're created for. So I've come up with workarounds where they can create textures or moods or atmospheres or feelings in spite of themselves. So yeah, it usually starts, like any work that's as seemingly structured as my work. I prefer and I almost demand of myself that I start from somewhere that has lively elements, whether it's expressive elements or variable line weights or unintended color bleeding effects that happen. I think that's the best place to start. And I changed my technique over the years. I've never really stuck to one methodology because as anybody that knows me or has read interviews that I do, I find joy in chaos, and I think the joy that I find in chaos many times is that once I've become comfortable with something, it starts to feel routine and boring and stiff and lifeless. So I find that if you just reverse the order of something or introduce a new medium or tool that I've never used before, that it just creates a little bit of chaos, which is where I feel comfortable. I don't know that I could ever be a technical illustrator. I don't know that I could ever take art direction because I change so much of my process as I'm going, and I do working as I do in such permanent media. And for people who may not have an in-depth knowledge of this, when you work with watercolor, you're always working from light to dark. Unlike acrylics or oils or digital media, you can't work back to light. You can't erase things. If it's on the paper and it's dark, it's on the paper and it's always going to be dark. There's no light, and I guess I sort of like that stricture in some ways. I was interested in oil painting in the early part of my life, and I still really enjoy that, but I haven't found a way to do it in this uh, for album cover artwork that is convincing to me. So, and then similarly with working with India ink and black ink, when it's down, it's down. If
Yeah.
you spill ink on your drawing, it's got ink spills on it for the rest of the time. You either have to start over or live with it. And I think that is, I think that requires of me the way that what I demand of images that I make, what I demand of my creative output is that there are elements of spontaneity that are more important and more prevalent than all of the analysis and research and critical thinking stuff and layout decisions that I make before uh, starting a piece. Those are so unimportant to me. It's just this routine. It's just this sort of like it's like a warm up exercise. A couple of weeks of sketching and
Yeah.
organizing and adding layout. I'll draft a piece. If you look at, like, for instance, if you look at the sketch for Purple, it's pretty much the what the finished thing looks like, with the exception of the fact that I change images. There's some images that I just don't want to do anymore, or there's some things that I'll change along the way. I just don't. I'm not interested in, whether it's musically, artistically, or poetically. I'm not interested in doing anything well enough that I then refine it to a sharp point, and then that's the blade, and that's the tool that I use. Is just this hyper refined, hyper uh, relatable, hyper predictable sort of outcome. I hate that. Of course, as artists, we sort of can't help but imbue our stamp, or our, if it's a visual language, if it's a type of line, if it's a type of color treatment. We can't help that. I mean, those are the things that that we have intrinsically. But I do my best to change that as frequently as possible because I appreciate art that feels like it's about to fall off the tracks. I appreciate music that sounds like it's just going to implode on itself. I think there's some real magic there where the unintentional bigger picture is, outweighs and supersedes what the artist's intent is. So I try to make, I do a ton of research when I'm making, big paintings. It's all about metaphors. It's all about visual symbolism. It's all about taking moments of my life or moments of my experience and finding an image that reminds me of that or gives me that impression and putting that on the paper, but then screwing with that as soon as possible and subverting what my idea of what I'm doing is as many times as possible. So there's this sort of Byzantine labyrinthine sort of, samurai steel 10,000 folds upon itself sort of thing where I'll start with a raw material and I just keep micro exploding elements of it until I don't know where I started. I don't remember what I was after because I don't think that's important. I think what is important is the self-expression aspects of what I do. So the fact, again, I'm making a very short question, a very long answer. What I find most distasteful about the media that I work in is that it's permanent. So I've come up with ways to subvert that permanence that are contradictory to common sense and contradictory to logic. Because when I distance myself from predictability and logic and rationale, then I feel like I am actually expressing myself. It's a very weird thing. I mean, I wish I was Anselm Kiefer and that was just or Pollock or something. It's just like the energy of color, the energy of paint, the energy of motion expressed on the page. But there is also a part of me that's undeniable that I can't fight, that I can only fight so far, that wants me to organize an image into a discernible composition and wants certain sort of shapes and elements and atmospheres. So yeah, I assume this is what all artists do in some form.
Yeah. Yeah, there's like there's like a spectrum of like really type A, very controlling, and then there's the type where it's like very loose, and whatever happens, the mistakes become the piece. I'm finding myself more drawn to what you're talking about too, where the looseness, the speed, the emotion of it. But for a long time, it was really controlled, and that
Yeah.
was the stuff that I was really interested in. So I'm kind of fighting those same instincts. I can relate.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I've got to put a sharp focus on this, but I think maybe in the world of music and the music that we're probably familiar with, and that a lot of your viewers and my viewers are probably familiar with, I think there has been this insistence at times, or this sort of cult of the cult of the line, I was calling it a few years ago, where it's just about creating this perfection of technique, this like and what I mean is precision and accuracy. And I think that there are a very, very small handful of artists for whom precision and accuracy can be used effectively as an artistic measure. However, I want to say that those people don't exist for the sake of this conversation, because I don't think that the self expressive person, the creative mind, can ultimately find anything of value in sharpening figurative imagery to such a fine point that it begins to approach reality. And I think that's where, I think that's where there's been some. I think that's where the internet fucks things up. Honestly, I think that's where
Yeah.
Instagram's really, really sent the artistic world, this part of the artistic world, like in the heavy art world, there's just too much focus on that precision, on that tightness, on that. I want to, the impulse that we have developed to render something so finely that it then the then it approaches reality, and when you're approaching reality, you've you've gone too far. We're supposed to be drafting super realities, things that are better than reality, or we're supposed to be reflecting the world that we see. And the world that we see, I think has energy and has liveliness and is unpredictable. So it runs counter to every artistic impulse that I've ever had, and every sensibility that I've ever had, that you would want to approach hyperrealism without understanding what the intentions of hyperrealist artists are, without thinking about that. There's a musical corollary, of course, uh, and it's this thing that Instagram does, where it feeds you a short clip, and it's just some guy shredding arpeggios, or it's just some wildly talented musician just doing runs and scales at lightning speed. Yes, it's impressive. Or the cult of the line that just seeks to create these unrealistically and unnaturalistically consistent, repetitive lines. Um, because when you scroll past it, it's impressive. And I'm the first to admit that it's impressive, but it's impressive as a craft. It's impressive as it's impressive in a workmanlike way,
Mhm.
and it leaves me momentarily dazzled, but ultimately it leaves no mark. It leaves no footprint in the sand. There's no shadow that it casts to me. It's just the whiff. It's just a whiff of smoke that turns your head, but then there's nothing there. I think that's something that I've tried to be aware of, and maybe a little overly critical on, but because I think that the alternative is trying to find genuine expression, which should be unique to the creator, should come should come with, maybe at times, through an artistic, historical context, that appreciates line work, that appreciates um, technique and rendering. But ultimately, those are tools. That's a hammer and a saw, or a scalpel rather. Um, and it's it's just a tool to express what you want. If you're only expressing, or if you get, it's as if you're like, it's as if we fall, and I do this all the time. I'm guilty of this. It's like we fall in love with the idea of the technique and need to play that passionate love affair with technique out over and over again. And it's very hard. I find it is very hard to discover the person, the personality. I find it's difficult to discover meaning and intention, and expression behind that, because it's like you start with something beautiful and then you just chisel away at what's great about it. It's why when you walk through a sculptural hall in a museum, you look at Rodin, because there's something that's so muscular and lively and expressive there, that is absent from the finely chiseled, finely worked over, finely polished, exacting work of lesser artists with greater technique, technical competency. Of course, again, I'm not saying that there aren't perfectionists in these media. I'm just saying that there's not many of them, and they don't get there by perfecting the technique only. You get there by understanding form, understanding how precision can be a tool for something otherwise. But let's face it, the visceral expressive qualities of visceral expressive artwork they are capable of a more deep and profound effect on the viewer or the listener, as it may be. And I think that's um, again, I'm not really sure what you asked me. I'm just talking about that now, but it's something I think it's I think it's critically important to recognize it, or to at least understand why maybe I would be worked up about this, because I think that I think that some of the digital tools and some of the you know the some as many maybe all aspects of social media have a net negative effect on the idea of art.
Yeah.
It can disseminate art, sure, it can spread it, and I think that's how we all get suckered into it. Just like Facebook, same with Instagram, same with whatever it is, TikTok, whatever the evil of the day is. They're alluring because they allow us all to have a platform to share out what we have with the world. But they share such an inaccurate version of that, such a microscopic detail, flattened, two-dimensional, and in many cases artificially enhanced version of what art can be, that I think it sets false expectations on artists.
Yeah.
Um, and I wouldn't say this if highly expressive art was what my Instagram feed gave me, but it gives me this like repetitive dribble that it's just like the artistic equivalent of a dude shredding scales. I don't give a shit if you shred scales. Like, good for you. I can't do it. I'm not. And so yes, partially I am jealous. You're dazzling me because you're doing something I cannot do. But I also think that it's then the duty and obligation of the person who has, accumulated that kind of technical precision and know-how to do something important with it.
Yeah.
And that's where I think that's the cliff that no one jumps off. That's the river to cross. Like, once you've, when if you're a tradesperson, you learn how to do your job as well as you can. But then you have to go out in the world and apply it. And it's not always in a pristine environment that you're applying your trade or applying your craft. So I think that artists would do well to understand how there is a gulf, there's a distance between what you've studied and what you're capable of doing and what you need to do, what your obligation is if you consider yourself an artist. Now, if you consider yourself a designer, commercial artist, illustrator, these rules do not apply, because if you're in that world, then you have a simple job. It's to satisfy the need of the advertiser or of the commercial outlet that you're working for. Then it's fine. But I think what we're talking about here is art, and art requires individualism. It requires self-expression. It requires an unflinching, true grit sort of attitude to know who you are and what you need to do. It requires the more important skill, I think to hone, at the risk of sounding slightly pedantic here, but I think the most important thing that we can do is hone our instincts and uh, our hone ourselves to have a gut level reaction, and to know what to do with that, know how to apply the tools that we've accumulated in order to act on the primal thing that requires less uh, analysis and less precision and less criticism.
Yeah. There's an element of conviction because, like, with social media, if you create something that you're decent on, but then all of a sudden it takes off, now there's a voice in your head that's like, oh, you should repeat that, and the next thing you know, you're just repeating, and you're in a cycle, and you're not
Right,
following your art voice.
right, and I think maybe fortunately for me, or one thing that has become an important aspect of my visual artwork is that I'm also a musician. So there are musical creativity is creativity. People all the time, well, is it that what drives you to make music? What drives you to make art? The same thing. I have a voice that I think is more important than this verbal voice of mine. Uh, and I think that the creative impulse to make something of value, or to share something of value, or to reflect on something that you've thought of, or just to react and respond on those impulses to the world around you, and to make something of it, to try to find your own way through that. I think it's been helpful for me, with the way that I work, to see how this parallels between the visual world and the audible world. And I think it's in music. It's so easy to hear conviction. It's so much easier for a listener to listen to an overwrought piece of pop music and go, yeah, this is like, it's superficial. I don't respond to it. Next.
Yeah.
But the visual equivalent of that sometimes is a little harder to discern, because music has a really quick conduit to your soul, to your heart, and so your brain processes that. I find quite quickly. Music's really easy to put you in a whole state of mind. Art requires a little bit more. It requires a little bit of context. It requires a little bit more analysis. But I think that at the core of it, there still is this gut reaction thing that that I find easier to easier to apply when thinking about this musical correlator. Okay, when I see an image that's impressive, based on how much technique was applied, or how smooth or how exacting the thing is, that's when I question. Then that's when I go, okay, now it's my duty as a viewer to work through that. And do I feel the artist's hand at work? Do I feel the artist's intent? It's maybe a good, maybe a cool way of looking at this would be like airbrush art.
Right.
Airbrush art in the '80s. It's just like very superficial, very glossy, very easily applied in commercial situations. But then you've got Geiger, who's using airbrush, certain elements of that, the atmosphere that the airbrush can create, but it's not so shiny, it's not so superficial, it's not so plastic. There's something, but it feels like it's wrapped in plastic, yet you see the viscous, uh disgusting entrails like sort of pulsing underneath it, and it takes on like a weird sexual liveliness, and like a sort of a, I think dystopian might be a bit of an undersell for it, but there's something that's really weird and discomforting and visceral beneath that shiny surface. And I think that's an example of it being used well. I think in music, the artificial, the this thing where he's triggering their drums, or doing these crazy unnatural sounding recordings, like 199.9999999% of the time, it's just awful. It's just awful to hear it. You're like, like the Stooges sounded so much better. But then a band comes who understands how to use that tool to to apply their messaging and to apply their intent, and you get Meshuggah, where the artificial aspects of it are part of the purpose of the messaging, part of the purpose of the art. And like I say, I think for the sake of like artistic conversations, we should just ignore those examples, because they're almost singularities. What I find most beautiful and simplistic and sublime about creating art and creating music is that anyone can do it, and anybody can do it well. But it requires the most difficult thing of all, which is expressing yourself and understanding how to let go of preconceptions, how to let go all the practice and all the technique for a moment, so that you can let this, don't mean this in, a sort of crystal Sedona way. I mean, you have to let inspiration speak through you. You have to understand you have to understand yourself well enough to know how to do that, or you have to have have the tendency to just turn off your rational mind and allow the reptile brain to take over. And it's clear. It's clear when you see it. It's clear when you hear it. And I think it's a standard that should be achieved whenever possible. I think that that tendency is something that we're all born with. We all, when we're children, we create, we make pictures. We create archetypal images. Every kid draws a family and a shining sun, and a dog and a cat. And it's like every child, or most children, just do that naturally. You don't have to be told to do that. You draw what you know. You draw what you feel. You draw things that are important to you. Special kids, you can see, have a little bit extra that they put into it. But everybody can do that. You put any 5-year-old in front of a piano, they're gonna bang out something that is an expressive piece of sound. When we hit adolescence, all of a sudden we become ashamed of what's of. All of a sudden, it becomes easier to be ashamed of self-expression, because self-expression is very personal. It's very exposed, and it's very easy to criticize at that age. So I think that's what prevents a lot of people from continuing to express themselves artistically, is that the closer you come to expressing who you are at your core, the more of yourself you share with the world, and the greater the sense of defeat can feel from criticism. So I think that was something, for whatever reason, that was something that became a very like prescient thing in my early life, was the idea that you could lose this thing, because I was a creative kid. I'm not 100%. I'm not very gifted musically. It's hard work. It's like I feel it, and the work is like trying to put it onto a guitar, trying to sing it. Like, I don't have a great voice. I'm not a super incredible guitar player, but I have learned how to use these instruments to express myself. I don't think it's that much different with visual art. The only thing was, I had a little greater facility with that when I was a child. So it was easier for me to express myself visually, and I got support, and people say, "Oh, that's really cool. You're really talented." I didn't think that was true even when I was a kid, and in the same way that I don't think it's true now. I But I was scared that you could lose that. I was terrified that something could happen to lose that would make you lose that. And I think around the time when I was an adolescent, I realized that the things I found the greatest value in that I had made were the things that were the most difficult for me to share with people. And something subconscious in me, this is just, my version of the story, is something subconscious in me at a relatively young developmental age said, maybe that's you've just found the threshold where you lose it. You're at this nexus. You need to live there. You need to break through this idea that if you share something too deeply personal with somebody, that they've got something on you. Now they can break you down. Now they've got ammunition against you. And it's hard to become deaf to that, but it can be done. And then I think this speaks to the greatest point of all, which is that if you are interested in the art, if you consider yourself an artist or a creative person, you have to share that part of yourself, and you have to learn how to do that, because the moment you stop creating based on your own impulses and your own instincts and your own redrafting of reality and your own reflections of experience and your own impulses, you're doing it for somebody else. And it's the moment you do it for somebody else, the moment you get positive affirmation for something you've done, and then you repeat that process, the second thing, the duplicate, is can be so negative that it can erase the value of the first thing that you did, whereby we have to walk this tight balance where, uh, if we're image makers, there's something that people recognize in our imagery that draws a through line between everything that we've ever done. Or for musicians, there are melodic ideas that I have a tendency for. You have to learn which of those things are intrinsic to you and which of those things you would maybe do because you think somebody else might like it. And when you're doing it for somebody else who likes it, you're a technician, you're a craftsman, you could be great at it, but you're not an artist. Or the art of what you do is less accessible for the viewer and the listener. I don't want to speak in like definites here because
Right.
that might, this is a developing theory that I've been working on for 45 years.
It's
But
also
I think
just a discussion. You're not writing it in stone.
no, but I'm acting. But what I try to do is act on it,
Yeah.
and by saying that, I need to admit that but just through virtue of saying it, I'm I make that mistake where I lull myself into a false sense of confidence because I've done something earlier in the year, earlier in my life that I received critical accolades for. I think, okay, well, I'm out. I'm sort of like running low on gas right now. That thing that I did before, I'll just sort of do that again. It's a subconscious thing that we do because we want to please people. Like as artists, especially as musicians, we're really super fragile. We don't want to hear negative comments. We want positivity. We want positivity because when I think that one aspect that we might not all admit, but most of us feel is that we have something of value worth sharing. Okay, so if and that's the only reason that music. I mean, yes, we have to make it, but we don't have to share it. So sharing it to me implies that we find value in it such that we're willing to release it to the public and see if they find value in it. Of course, that runs the risk of no one finding value in it. But hey, that's that's the world of art. Like you have to be good at it. You have to put yourself out there. But it is it's certainly a difficult thing not ever living in a profession where, at least from my vantage point, my profession would be over and my professional contribution would drop to nil if I rested on my laurels for a moment.
What's kind of like your day to day when you're not on tour, like in terms of just your art practice? Like, or is every day so different? I'm just kind of generally
I th-
curious.
I think every day is different, but I'm not. I wish I was better at routine. I wish I was better at communicating, and I wish I was better at doing the thing that I said I was going to do. I'm a pretty disorganized. I have a pretty disorganized brain, uh, in reality, and it's actually a, a very difficult thing to live with. So many times, what I do is it's what my days are like. It's almost like throwing random darts at random dartboards and just seeing if something hits, then I'll just stick with that. But I'm very scatterbrained. Like it has been a common thing with me forever. I don't know how to stay focused. So what I try to do is I on some days I just kind of cycle through. Well, I'll play piano for 5 minutes, then I'll start sketching, then I'll work on the computer, and then I'll draw. And one thing is, one thing is going to like stick with me such that I'll stick with it. I always want it to be art and music. You always want it to be one of those things, but
Yeah.
sometimes I get distracted and I'll like try to learn. I'll just try to learn some other random thing for a while. Like I'll get into cooking for a couple of years, or I'll get really into like carpentry electrical stuff or pro audio gear. And I know in my heart that there's like two things that I do that keep my family alive, that, pay my bills. And so ultimately I have to come back to those things. But again, I do consider myself an artist, and for many times for worse, but I think ultimately for the better. If I don't think it's worth doing, I won't do it. I won't do it simply to make a paycheck. I won't do it simply because it's a smart thing to do. I, I really like thinking things aren't a good idea to do and seeing what comes out the other end, because I want adventure. I want discovery. I want to create in the same fashion in many ways that I did when I was a child and didn't know that other people had value, held what I did in any value. So I want to be free like that. And so there's no way there's no set thing to do for that. Sometimes, I mean, like sometimes it's like, I'll I think physical fitness has been great for me, like running or going to the gym, because those things are so physical that, in the way that some people like write songs in the shower, or come up with like creative ideas when they're doing something that's just distracting. Those sometimes intense physical output calms the noise in my head enough that I can actually come up with something. Because there's one aspect to my thought process which is increasingly difficult to deal with, which is that I cannot think internally. It's my Unfortunately, there's so much noise in my, logic mind that I can't think through a I can't think through any kind of question. I can't A simple question. I have to speak it, or I have to put it on paper, or I have to work it out on, musically. It's 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 awful, because the ideas are always there's always like 150 ideas just bouncing off the walls of my brain, but I can't cut through the noise and figure out how to organize them. So I just have to act instinctively, if at all, and or I have to talk to somebody like you to hear what my opinions are, because I don't know them until I talk. Sometimes it's just,
Yeah,
you can only put one thought out at once.
for sure. Let's pull up some of the visual art, because I think that'll just kind of lead us in conversation too. Just one second.
Hmm.
We've talked about some of these things. First thing before we forget, you do have a print release coming up for Purple, and I got just like a little preview of the print there, as well as that drawing that accompanies the bottom, which is
Oh, yeah, yeah.
like full detail. But yeah, go ahead and speak to that, because I want to make sure people are aware of this.
Yeah. So, like, for the uninitiated, this is a record that came out in 2015 or something. So the artwork's been out there for ages, and up until a few years ago, I had very, 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 very intentionally never made a full color, unedited, unabridged version of any of our album covers available commercially. Um, and it's not something that I'm not interested in doing that, in some ways.
Hmm.
But I felt that also that I'd sort of reached a time where, many of these images have now lived in, the collective consciousness for long enough that maybe it was time to start doing that. And I work with some incredibly talented screen printers from Minneapolis called Night Swim Project, uh, who whom I've been working with through various through the other shop that they came from, which was Burlesque of North America, since the aughts. At some I don't know, decade and a half ago, I started picking up with these screen printers, and over the years we've developed methods using screen printing to approximate these densely layered images in full color. It's a very difficult process. It's not like a digital G-Clay print that just a computer spits it out and uses it's computer mined to get the colors accurate, but it's more it's more like an artisan sort of representation of the album cover. So I started with red. I've done red. I did blue, yellow, and green. Now we're at purple. So I think it ended up being 15 or 16 colors on like a high quality cotton paper. It's a very challenging thing to achieve for screen printers because you have, first of all, the image has to be separated in such a way that like physical ink laying on top of paper can congeal and make these great subtle gradations in color and get the idea and intention of the artwork across. But then lining those all up in such a specific way, that's just beyond me. I'm not a calculated guy, so I don't do the screen printing myself. But with the advent of the first one, when we released Red, Jody from Night Swim Project, with whom I've been doing not just silkscreen projects, but events all over the world. We've been doing things for years together. She had just started working with like a fabrication shop, another also in Minneapolis called Studio on Fire, who does like all the sort of high end packaging details that people find interesting, like the die cuts or foil stamps, embosses, old fashioned letterpress techniques. All these like, but they're a modern shop that uses, like from what I can tell, half of their equipment is contemporary equipment, half their equipment's like old fashioned, really high end, like old German presses and blades and all that stuff. So they had the capability to do these sculptural embosses in the paper, which is something that I had seen. I think I have a print from years ago by Aaron Horkey that had a sculptural emboss. And then I noticed that this artist called James Jean had been doing these small sort of like vignette images at the bottoms of his prints. And I thought, well, that would be super cool for this long-term print project that I'm doing with the Baroness album covers, because I kind of, because part of my attitude and part of my mentality when selling prints and reproducing artwork and making it commercially available is that I really want to give people something that's more than they could get just simply by printing the imagery out. So I thought this would seem like a cool opportunity and a local shop with awesome people running it that could do this. So as this print project's gone on, I've learned a little bit more and more about how these images are made. And it's kind of a fun process that you start with a sketch, send it to them, and they have the computer masterminds that know how to do the digital, like the 3D renderings of it, and we just sort of go through a back and forth process of improving that until it's good to go. But with this one, I sort of like the image. It's kind of cool. I use, with all of them, I'm using relevant visual elements from the artwork itself, and just creating a sort of a little embellishment or emblem at the bottom. So with this one, it's the little rodents that are crawling all over the lady in the bottom quadrant, and the rose that's in the center of the image. And then I just did a pen and ink version of that as well, which anyone who buys these is going to get just for free. Again, it's about I think as an artist, I'm very, although I've been doing it for years, I'm never really comfortable with the sort of the commercial aspects of this. So I have to think, if I'm creating a product for people, like, can I do something extra that makes it just a little bit special, or can I make it so affordable that that everybody can become an art collector, which this is not. This will be sort of a high end item for me. But it's been fun. It's been fun to try to figure out with these album cover artwork prints how to add something extra to it so that it becomes it becomes a separate piece unto itself. And that's one of the things I've always found interesting about Silkscreen, uh, is that it is a reproduction of a piece of artwork, but there's something inherent in the reality of printed ink, screen printed ink, that it becomes then an object of itself, which stands slightly separate but runs parallel to the original artwork. They're they're different things, but I find that as opposed to a digital print, it has weight, it has substance. Maybe that's something to do with the fact that ink is in layers and has a physical dimension, a very micro fraction of physical existence on top of the paper. That this is the sculptural embossed thing sort of like heightens that sense of dimension to the thing. But ultimately, I think it's just something cool that the people who collect it, when displayed, there's obviously something that's been added to this piece that's a little extra.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Um, in terms of Purple itself, in thinking of like the whole package for the album, vinyl, CD, etc. Did you? How did you collaborate with Merald on that? Do you recall that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I have a fairly long term philosophy about making art in the music community, which is that it is always a better option to work within the community than to hire outsiders. And Merald was somebody. I think I met him. I think he's going to kill me if I get this wrong, but
I
I
just
think
interviewed
I
him, so I can I asked him the same question, so I can help
okay,
you.
because I met him in. I want to say it was. Did he tell you where it was? Was it Amsterdam?
It was in Netherlands, and it was like
Was it
mid two
Nijmegen?
thousands.
Okay, it was in mid 2000s, right? He came to one of the first shows that we ever played, the Baroness ever played in Netherlands.
Mhm.
Uh, on that tour, we had a roadie for about 10 or 12 years called Jeremy Hush or Jeremy Clark. He goes by Hush. He was our roadie. So Jeremy and I and Marl, there's a picture of all the three of us the night that we met him, and I think we're all bald in the picture, which is why it's funny. But I've been like very close friends with him ever since then, and I was prior to meeting him, I was extremely familiar with his output because he had. I think the first thing that he had done that I became aware of was a cover for Wolf Brigade's D Beat Odyssey LP, which I was a huge fan of, which he gave me as a gift, if you can believe it. It was a beautiful little, I think it's gouache and maybe a little bit of airbrush. It's this gorgeous little, tiny little piece, totally in his, early work of his. It's totally exemplary of his style. Tight details, tons of like beautiful texture, and like a great narrative sort of high concept piece. And I think we really clicked because where he was like clearly like somebody with an immense amount of technical know-how. He also was someone who in the scene of like crust punk and heavy music, he was somebody that really cared about the underlying meaning of his work, the stuff that the viewers did not need to concern themselves with necessarily. The symbolism, the allegory, the art historical references. We just kind of really always were sort of kindred spirits in that realm. So I thought it would be really an interesting thing for him to work for us, because I don't think he'd ever worked with a band quite like us, or maybe that was going to press quite as many records as some of his former projects had. Whatever it was, he was just a friend, and I, whenever humanly possible, if I am ever in a position to offer a platform to my talented friends, I want to do that. I'm a firm believer in loyalty. I'm a firm believer in working with people who know you and respect you and who you love, because those are the only people that I'll work with, because I think in a world of art that's ultimately going to be used as packaging, where there is a commercial element to it, we need to put passion into it. We need to care, and we get more passion. We get a greater artistic output when we're working with people who have skin in the game, who care about it, who want to see the success of the record as much as they want to see their image reproduced and disseminated into the public. So it can be work finding pure souls like that in this industry. And Marl's just, there are no souls pure. He gives everything he's got to it. He's highly and emotionally invested in the work that he does. And I think I thought that would just be something that would be a cool blend. And further to that, his style is different than mine, without being incongruous. So it seemed like it would be a good match of our minds to work to collaborate on that package. And then furthermore on the follow up, Golden Gray.
Okay, I know he did work for that as well.
Yeah, he did more work for that. He did more illustrations for Golden Gray than I could possibly use. And we did the package includes a gigantic booklet that features his artwork very highly. And then with the new record Stone that we just released, I felt like we had established that we have a working relationship. I will continue to work with Viral endlessly in the future, but I thought now would be a good time to highlight somebody that was relatively new to me, but who was working within our music community, who is highly talented. It's I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but his first name's Surya. He goes by Surrealism online, and I
Unreal
worked.
stuff.
Yeah, I worked with him on the back cover of Stone. So his image is the entire reverse side of that. Because with Stone, I had this idea that there was going to be two identities to the record. One that was all color and all, like a hallucinogenic amount of, hyper rainbowism. And then I wanted the split identity of this record to also be this like firm black and white, sort of stark thing. And his work was, I found some imagery. I've been following him for a while, but I've noticed that occasionally he would do these images that it didn't seem like they were planned very much.
Yeah.
It seemed like they were very discovered in the process. And he was one of the first and primary examples I can give of somebody who for whom this, like, the cult of the line applies to, but who's then taken the idea of these perfected etching style, like traditional lines that have a tendency, in my opinion, sometimes to veer too far into plastic vacuousness. And he seemed to have found a way to imbue personality and express it in personal expression, self-expression, and expressiveness to this style by seemingly disconnecting from the figurative aspects of it and just hinting at them. So I was very insistent. I said, I'm going to give you lyrics to one of the weirdest, most visual songs on a record, and I don't want I want you to just use that as like a place to start, but like I need chaos. I need abject chaos, just constant things evolving and folding in on themselves. It's almost like the artistic rendition of John Carpenter's The Thing. It's just like a beast that keeps metamorphing into something weirder and grosser and less uh, terrestrial, which, like a kind of a Lovecrafty sort of attitude, which I really like about. There's a handful of artists that really seem to capture that weirdness and that weird sort of dark hallucinatory chaos really well. And he's one of them. So it was really fun to work with him. But back to Moral, like he and I after Purple, then we hosted an exhibition in Minneapolis at the exhibition hall of burlesque screen printers where we showed all of his work, a handful of original pieces of mine, and we worked on a big mural together. But he and others, the other artists that I've collaborated with over the years have really been super fun to work with and inspiring, and pushed me to try things that I never thought I'd do or never thought I could do. So yeah, here's a picture of myself and Merald painting. It's just a big um, piece of plywood. We've done this. We've done this a couple times, a couple different plywood pieces. He's exceptional at it. I mean, his mind is much more organized than mine. So he would see this thing and help me manage what I was about to happen on a large surface without sweating the details or the layout too much. He's a really really fun, hardworking guy to be around.
Yeah, I could totally see that from my conversation with him. Let me put it back to where it was. Next, wanted to kind of show some of the process for stone. So we got the sketch here on the left, and then just your line work here. In terms of the sketch and like compiling like all the references and getting your head together, like do you find that to be the hardest part or the most time consuming?
It's certainly is time consuming, but it's very research based, and
Mm.
I like the research because through a formal through a formal investigation of ideas and sort of like I'll do a thumbnail. Let me see if I got one nearby. No, this book doesn't have them. I'll do these little thumbnails that look like utter garbage, and and many times aren't really pictures of anything. It's just sort of energy movement. Like
Oh yeah, I can
if you
relate.
could imagine, what a storm system looks like when warm air and cold air hit, I just feel like, well, is the wind circular? Is a Mobius shape? Is a triangle? Is there a circle? Or whatever. I think like geometrically in geometric simplicity, and then I put a little 1 by 2 inch thumbnail, and it'll just make me think of something, and that thing that it makes me think of will make me think of something else. So I get into the research phase of these larger, more involved pieces that I do, and uh, part of it is that I always want to draw from lived experience. Every piece of artwork that I do, whether it's for a client or somebody I'm working with, I don't know why I said client. I don't consider them client. If I'm working with somebody,
Hmm.
uh, I still find a way to include myself because I don't think it's dutiful or respectful not to put a little bit of yourself or a lot of yourself into everything that you do. I think it allows the idea of working for another band. Uh, I get to be a fan. I get to be an audience member, and I get to put my own take on what I think I'm hearing. But when it's Baroness, it's a much 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 more personal thing. So I had with every record cover that I've done for Baroness, I have chosen at least one fundamental aspect of the others and changed that as drastically as I can. And sometimes it's just simple things like for the album cover for Golden Gray, I didn't use any black ink. That
Yep.
was the challenge. For Purple, I used limited black ink. I mixed all my colors, and I worked with microns for the first time, colored microns, and I chose to do like an insanely layered, insanely like naturalistic sort of take on it. Whereas sometimes I try to be a little bit more abstract or visual or whatever. Just everything's got to be different. So with Stone, the thing that I had begun to feel confined by in a very difficult to reconcile with way was that all of our other covers I had done a sketch, and then I had done a full ink drawing, and I basically painted over that and worked into the ink drawing. With stone, I really, really wanted to avoid the amount of line art that I did. So when we're looking at the sketch here, and then we're looking at the it's it's just kind of a photo I took because I didn't, it wasn't enough of a drawing, an ink drawing to scan. Um, but I've just put the basics in, and I think I even maybe put more line work in than I had initially intended to. But I started painting at that stage where only the details that I thought were important had been rendered. You know, like I didn't feel like I could go back and get some of these like strange, like the barbed wire mask or the ropes. I just felt like if I painted, I was going to lose sense of that and not know how to get back to it. But it was a huge risk. It was because it was an entirely different way of working, and every time I changed something that dramatically, I 100% make mistakes. Every one of our record covers, I there's some huge error that like guides the rest of the artwork that I'm not always stoked with. But I think that with this one, the challenge was really nice. And then further to that, because I'd done so much painting, I wanted to use some of the technical stuff that I had learned. A lot of wet on wet painting as the underlayers. And if you can see in the picture you displayed on the right, I'm using this was a brush that I had discovered over the course of the past 3 or 4 years, which is not not like typically I would paint with Kolinsky sable brushes like Windsor Series 7. Those are kind of my go-tos for uh, controlled expressive artwork. Like they were kind of the industry standard at that point. But I had seen some artists who were working with these mop brushes made from blue squirrel hair, which is it's 180 degrees different from Kolinsky sable. Keeps a point, holds a ton of water, but keeps a point. Snaps. You can vary things in a really. It's almost more like drawing. It's a little bit more like drawing. With the mop brush, it holds 10 times the amount of water. It doesn't show a point. But because the bristles are so soft, they literally never make contact with the paper. There's always enough friction in between the water and the bristle that it doesn't upset the pigment beneath it. So it's gentler. It's gentler over ink. It's easier to create gradations. It's easier to express. It's easier to paint intuitively with it, but it's a totally different technique. It also requires a great deal of understanding. So it was a very challenging tool to use for a piece of artwork that had so much line art in it. But
Yeah.
I think it's fully how I will continue to work in the future. But generally speaking, our album covers and album covers that I work, I do a sketch, then I do an ink drawing, and then I paint becomes involved at some point in that, and then you just refine until it's done. In the early part of my career, I would do a very much looser, less rendered sketch. Then I'd do a fully rendered black ink on plate Bristol, which was a type of drawing surface that is very clean and very clear with India ink. Then I would scan that, print that, and then paint a print. Uh, yeah, for instance, I did that with this Cavellic thing. So you can see this sketch is more or less like on point with the final, but the black and white version of this is my favorite. And this scan doesn't do it justice. There's something physically beautiful about the stippling and the line art there. But you can see that I think it's also possible to see when looking at this that some areas of form are rendered and have weight and depth and are sort of dark, for lack of a better term, but other areas are left more or less open. I'm just making decisions. I'm making calculated decisions on where I'm going to apply ink or not ink, watercolor when it's done. And so then if we switch the last one, it's the painting, and I think I actually really like this painting. it was, I think, and I think it was this one when I did this was a good experiment because it was one of the more successful gatefolds that I did. But you can see that like the original sketch is basically there in it's no, it's literally there. Like even down to some of the line weights I mimicked with the ink. It's just like it's a colored ink drawing, and that was what I started to get a little bit sick of with these colored ink drawings. So in more recent years, the conclusion I've come to of late is that I missed doing the sketch and then the really nice black and white on with fine details. I really missed the physical qualities of seeing that much ink. And the thing that I was frustrated with was that the beautiful drawing I never fully rendered for album covers because if I would to go fully with it, I would have to do too much shading, and then the color wouldn't. What's the point in putting the color in there? Uh, so after, I think it was directly after this album. I think the album cover that I did directly after this was Serpents Unleashed, which was the first record that I ever did that the ink and painted part are the same. I think I have it here. Hold on. I don't know if we'll be able to tell through video if so. The draw. Oh, they can see the ring light. I'm using a ring light, so you can see that. Uh, like it's. I was using a watercolor paper, and it didn't really take the ink as well as I would have liked to, but it took the watercolor great. So then I found myself with a problem, which was I have to use a very specific. I had to do tests with about 15 or 20 different black inks to find which one bled the least. Fortunately, it was a easily attainable, high quality ink that I prefer. And further to that, I have to paint on water, or I have to draw on with ink on watercolor paper, which has a slightly toothier surface and didn't allow for. It's not the precision of the line that I'm totally, as you can tell, that I'm totally obsessed with. It's that it would drag the paintbrush would drag in a way that I was unfamiliar with. It wasn't quite as fluid, so it was a sort of a struggle working like that, and has continued to be. But I've come up with workarounds for that. So, oh yeah, and you can see here here's Taste the Sin, which where the sketch is again, it's pretty much all there. I don't think I changed too many details there. And then I did a black and white drawing, scanned that, printed it out, painted it. But that seemed like cheating to me. I'm like, I also the thing I struggle with is the distance between the artist's hand and the final product. If you scan once and print, you've just created a huge chasm between the original thing and its texture and its the weight of that ink on paper between that and then the painted thing. It just felt like cheating. Like I'm like, what am I, a comic artist? Not that there's anything wrong with being a comic artist, but I'm not one,
Right. No,
I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to learn how to be a comic artist to do this. So yeah, so the records I've done since Serpents Unleashed really have all been experiments in how to approximate the clarity and consistency of the line art that I'd done prior to that with creating a more individual piece. Oh wait, no, and then I think the thing that's really different about Stone is those sketches were just references. The artwork for Stone is the drawing the drawing is underneath, ink on top, watercolor on top. There was never any scanning whatsoever. I wasn't using a light pad and tracing or like rendering in ink what was on a piece of paper below it, which is how I work sometimes. So yeah, I don't know. It's like materials make a huge difference, and every material that I use has pluses and minuses. But since I've become more enamored of watercolor painting, I tend to paint now on uh, very traditional, like super heavy arches watercolor paper.
Hot
Uh,
press?
no,
Okay.
well, stone was hot pressed, but everything else that I've been doing has been cold pressed.
Hmm. Okay.
Hot pressed feels it sort of feels like an unfair middle ground between drawing paper and watercolor paper.
That's why I
You
like it.
know, that's why it's acceptable when you need to when I need to know what I'm doing a little bit. I'll use that.
Yeah.
But this past few weeks, I've actually been working on. I've reverted back to working on plate Bristol, like Strathmore 500 series plate Bristol,
Hmm.
which I can't believe I put it down for 10 years. It's just like a totally cool, fun surface to draw on with ink. And I hadn't used isograph pens, like technical pens, in 10 years. I bought some new ones, and I'm just loving it. Yeah, it's weird, but
Smooth, man. It feels good, doesn't it?
it does for sure.
In terms of watercolor, have you dabbled in rough paper at all?
I mean the the cold press that I use is fairly rough, but I haven't ever gone full tilt with the Arches rough surface.
Yeah.
I'd like to.
There's a watercolorist. He does mostly like portrait stuff. Jay Hung Sung, but he does
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah.
And
He he's he is a daily source of
yeah,
technical inspiration. I mean, I sort of hate what he does, but
you can't help but love it
I
though.
love
Yeah.
watching him do it. Yeah, I mean, there's something beautiful to the way he does does things. So I really have been. I'll just watch one of his paintings, and I that's what the Memento Mori series is in some ways. It's there's a few other artists like him that work with that sort of specifically I think Chinese sort of watercolor technique.
Hmm.
Um, and so I'm pretty heavy handed with it. I eventually I just become like rough, heavy, muscular, sculptural with the paint after a certain point. But the first first hour or two of these paintings is like absolute magic because it's almost like um, you can't try to do anything. You have to do it fast, and you just have to change. You just have to say this section feels cooler, so I'm going to use
Feels
a
like a
cooler color.
performance, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah, a performance that always goes wrong if you work on it. If you work on it past the initial stage, it is always going to go wrong.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't get better; it just gets more realistic looking. But those first, the magic of watching, just applying pigments, like seemingly random pigments into other pigments and letting them flow together is it's like alchemy because you do have to understand the nature of each pigment. That's the thing that was always so mysterious with watercolor for me was, for instance, if you're working acrylic or oil maybe a little bit, but colors are all closer in opacity to one another, closer in their handling and viscosity to one another. Whereas watercolor, with the absence of a of a of the linseed oil or the acrylic medium, which is that consistency, you basically have some pigments which are more sedimentary than others and will block, form little clusters, and you have some values which are more transparent, some values which are more opaque, some values which have a higher tinting or lower tinting strength create more or less granulation. So it's been really kind of fun to you know, learn why I like ultramarine versus why I like phthalo versus the earth, the earth pigments versus the synthetic pigments. There's just this beautiful sort of little thing that they do that if you try to predict it, it's kind of you're already in the wrong spot. You just you do it once and then take your hands off it. You have to, or else you'll fuck it up, and it looks great. It's just a
Yep.
beautiful process.
Teaches you restraint, that's for sure. Like the one on
Absolutely.
The bottom right, I love those lost edges right around the mouth, man. Like you just left
Yeah,
those breathe, dude. So good.
I don't know. I know, and I'm always trying to do that.
I know.
I don't know what happens along the way. It's just, you know, I think sometimes I think that I just work. I have a bad habit of working too close to the paper or too close to the canvas if I'm working, and I don't. The restraint for me oftentimes is just like stand up, step back, look, learn, and then go dive back in. But I'm kind of furiously neurotic when I paint, so I just don't stop until it takes too much form on sometimes for me. You can see in all these paintings, you can see where I really wanted it to just drift into, some sort of magical place where you know, like in that bottom right hand painting, you know what's happening down there. It's just out of focus. It's just not, you know, the idea that, I mean, watercolor is wonderful because you can do this thing with it that where you can really create a center point of focus and then let the less important details or allow the atmosphere to creep in where, where we don't need to know the the boundaries of one object into the next. Those boundaries are sort of false anyway. And I've been working so long with pen and ink that all I do is create boundaries. All I do is create boundaries. It's been very freeing for me to work with watercolor and to begin to understand how, well, if we look at the painting on the far left, I've chosen to create a hard line at the top because that's the way that light feels on a dark background. It creates that hard edge, but elsewhere the edges can become softer, and it draws your eye certain places and lets you ruminate on others. And I think that's a wonderful thing. It's very difficult to achieve that with ink and pens. Maybe with washes it would be a different thing, but with ink and pens, we're always, this is why great comic artists like um, John Buscema or Jack Kirby were really like true artistic geniuses and true artists, was that they understood and dedicated themselves to not only to creating a narrative thing, but to understanding how energy works with black and white, energy with hard lines, and they create somehow those guys as who I consider two masters. I guess Frank Miller's in there, and uh,
Manola.
there's Mike Mignola, who I adore, does this as well. But they've figured out ways to create softness and uh, atmosphere using, again, those two tones, black and white. I mean, colors kind of in comics. I think color sometimes is just a necessary evil sort of thing. It's just like, well, we gotta make it jump off the page somehow. But the real beauty to it is this, in Mignola's case, the contradiction between big surfaces of white, big surfaces of black, and areas of shadow that have no form, no substance whatsoever, but imply. Or Frank Miller is all, where it's just like all black, and he somehow carves out space and movement and form using just as little white as possible. But back to the like Kirby's and Bishimas of the world. I always, because that was how I learned how to draw. I was very fortunate. I was very fortunate when I was young that my mother was, she took my artistic impulses seriously, and I think by the time I was 6 or 7, I was doing life drawing classes, or I had started doing life drawing classes, and it gave me it was like a head first sort of exposure therapy to how seriously you can take drawing. I was very impressed by that, and I think one of my instructors, or somebody was teaching a class or hosting a life drawing session somewhere, one of those. Um, recommend. I was interested. I was a comic reader when I was young, but I don't think they knew this. And I was just like curious because I wanted to get better at human forms. And I recognized that, in the 80s and certainly by the 90s, that a lot of comic art was fantastic. There was some very like exaggerated things. There were some non-natural uh, anatomic elements, but so I wanted to learn more about form, and I said, where can I start with this? I had I already had a couple of like the Bridgman books, which so he was like an early that was early material that I had, but it's very dense.
Yeah,
It's
that's
very
hard
hard.
for being a kid.
It's very hard. It's very hard. But I understood that what he was talking about with blocking was that there's an internal geometry that if you understand it, you understand more about. You have a very powerful tool when it comes time to render. But anyway, long story short, this guy recommended. He was like, you can't do any better than How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way.
Classic.
It's a classic. I've probably bought that book 5 times over the past 40 years because I think it never goes out of style. It's the lessons in that book. It really gives you as clear a picture on everything that you need to know about drawing as any book I've ever read. It doesn't go too in depth, but it covers the fundamentals. It covers the basics better than any drawing course that I took at highfalutin art schools or any book that I've ever come across since then. It's like biblical in its importance.
I pulled this up. You did like a Ask Me
I did an
Anything on Instagram.
AMA.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
took screenshots of.
trying so hard to make the internet work for me.
Well, I mean, I thought it was fascinating. So I got the brushes that you're using. I use a lot of the similar ones, Winsor Newtons, and then the squirrel brushes for the mops. I noticed a couple that caught my eye here. So you got a couple Roger Dean books. You got Views. I saw Yoshi Toshi in there as well. So you
Yeah, yeah,
pull from
favorite.
Japanese art as well.
Constantly. I think it's hard to work figuratively and with the idea of being artistic without developing a fascination and love for Japanese art. I mean, and traditional. Like um, I have one Hiroshige woodblock print that I traded somebody 4 years ago. But I love I love the style. I love the substance. I love the color treatment. I love in a way that I don't with many styles. I like the parameters and the rules that need to be adhered to because I think that conceptually, what has always been apparent to me in Japanese art is that within those structures is the requirement, the demand, the obligation that the artist also expresses themselves genuinely through those rules. And when you look at some sort of academic drawing uh, concepts, that's not the case. The case is just like render form as it needs to be. Here are the ways to do that. Da 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 da. A lot of Western art either is rule free or so tied up in its own rules that I don't think it allows for this sort of quiet admittance that within the confines of traditional Japanese line art, that you're in some ways I think you're witness to the entirety of that artist's style in any one line that you see, and I think that's such an impressive mentality. I don't have it in that same way. I think with my work there's a bit more to it, but I really love like Yoshitoshi, Hiroshige, Hokusai, the masters. Are huge models for me, and I think there's a lot to be learned from from their brushwork and their line work. and from the printing techniques. I mean, there was one class that I took. I dropped out of art school and was like getting myself straightened out because I was in pretty bad shape in my early 20s, and so I moved back to my home county in Virginia in the mountains, and I just sort of, I was doing the thing where I didn't have a phone or a car or a TV or anything like that, just like kind of living on the side on the edge of the river and just working all day painting houses. And I wanted to take there was a some art classes that I could take at a local college, so I just took one class in Asian art just to keep myself busy. And the instructor or the professor was covered one thing that I thought was really interesting, which was they were showing, and these were like I think this was in Chinese brush painting, but it was no, it was Japanese. These were two Japanese artists doing paintings of like water, the cliff waterfall,
Yeah.
sort of those sort of traditional silk.
Kioi, or however you pronounce it.
Yeah, escapes me now. It's been ages, but it shows the same subject matter and basically the same composition and basically what looks like the same waterfall as rendered by two separate artists. And one is very academic, very beautiful and refined and sophisticated, but kind of common to, you know recognizable and like so recognizable that you couldn't name the artist. But then the other one was like wild, just complete energy overload. Just like marks are all over the place. So much beautiful, tortured energy. And the professor goes, "Well, this is a self-evident uh, lesson." But she says one of these pieces was made uh, by a very well known at the time artist who was did a lot of who, court paintings and was making tons of money and held in high esteem. The other one was done by someone who we would now uh, probably recognize as a schizophrenic, a tortured a tortured soul who there's very little information about them other than they were uh, just absolutely mentally tortured. And it's obvious that it was obvious to me in that moment how important the the character of your line can be,
Mhm.
how much of a story it can tell, how it can actually become so much more important than the image. And I think that with much Japanese artwork that I admire, there are clearly images that we can all recognize, and they're telling us a story from mythology or a historical story or whatever. But more important to me is that the abstraction thereof tells me something interesting and gives me insight into the artist and something that I appreciate. And I think that the Yoshitoshi had a solo exhibition at the Philadelphia Museum of Art a couple years ago. So I got to see a few hundred pieces. It was really an impressive show. It was extremely cool. Colors were so much more vibrant and phenomenal than I thought they would be.
Wow. Yeah, it's nice too. Just even collecting books, like I mean, it's one thing to see the images on your phone, and of course, the best experience is seeing them in person. But collecting books, because I also do it as well, helps me just kind of stay focused on it and like truly take the time to appreciate, just like
Sure.
buying physical product for music, you know. So it's something that I advocate for other
Yeah, and what
forms
I,
of
I
art.
found I found a good place to start because it's like it felt like a daunting world for me. I had a ton of old art books that I inherited or some from my days in school. Uh, but then I'm like, I want to collect more beautifully printed art books, which it just continue to be more beautifully printed. But where do I even start? I like so many things. I don't know where to start. So I just started going to museums and buying whatever the exhibition was. So I saw, a couple years ago, I saw Jasper Johns, another favorite of mine. They had a book of his stuff. They had the book for the exhibition, so I just bought that. I was in Leiden with Merald a few years back, and we went to see an exhibition in Leiden about young Rembrandt, like Rembrandt when he was young.
Mm.
So everything, when he was still like a pretty formal type painter. And so I bought a book there, and whenever I'm in Austria, I always go crazy because they got Leopold, the Belvedere, uh, natural or the art historic museum there, and just incredible books. So I fortunately I get to travel a lot for my other job, and because of that, I go see a lot of museums, and I'll just buy a book from the museum about something that's there, and then it gives me something that I can remember, and I remember the reason why, and it gives me a little further impetus to dig in. But yeah, I think books the art books in my collection are so much more satisfying as reference and inspiration material than Pinterest or Instagram. You edit this down, right? Or
Some. I
or the
mean,
whole thing. Okay, so this is it. We're live.
I, mean,
I know.
I think it's interesting. So
I just talk so much sometimes. I'm always afraid of people having to
makes it easier
listen
for
to
me.
listen to all my garbage.
All right, I just want to show just some sketches that you've done because I think it's kind of cool to see, stuff that's spur of the moment, trying to figure stuff out, problem solving in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I like these better than everything else I do sometimes.
Yeah, that's how it is.
You know what I mean? Like, there's something. I have. I will admit this again. Like, I'm not trying to make a thing of it, but I've got a pretty disorganized brain, so I have to keep a lot of journals that are just lists of things that I do during the day. And when I'm ramping up to do projects, I tend to go kind of crazy in these journals, like moleskins or something. I see people that make moleskins like these beautiful, intricate art projects, but they're pretty much like if you look at the picture on the left. I think I was like thinking about. I was doing this was for when we released a song called "Shock Me," and we wanted to do a video for it, and I was just doing some concept sketches for the video, but also trying to make my pens work for the last, and just playing around because I'm messy, I'm sloppy. It's a mystery and a miracle to me that when I'm finished with something, it looks so clean. But the funny thing is, you never really see the margins of my work. All my paintings, if you look beyond the mat, they're awful. It's just like I have real like heavy hands, so it's all just like smudged oil, pencil, like oil from my hands, oil from whatever, inks, everything, just notes and garbage materials. And then once I get inside the picture frame, I'm like, oh, okay, gotta be a little bit more quiet.
Yeah.
But yeah, like I think that that's when sometimes I'm in more of a mood to sketch and play around than others. But when I am, I'm always really pleased with the results because I don't care. I just don't care. It's like automatic drawing, and I think it's kind of beautiful sometimes.
Yeah, totally. I always wrap up with this because everyone has a slightly different answer. But if you were to give advice to anyone who, let's say, they're beginner to intermediate level in their art skill and they just want to take it to the next level, that could mean working in commercial projects or it could just mean getting better. Do you have any advice for that person?
Yeah, I mean, my advice sometimes is it's not good advice for everybody trying to make it,
Hmm.
but I think it's good advice if you're trying to. Okay, this is what I did, and I think it was helpful for me. But in specifically relating to working within the music community, if that's it
That's the
seems like
common
a lot.
thread here.
It
Yeah.
seems like a lot of the artists you talk to, work in that regard. Just do it for free at the beginning of in order to get your work out there, do it for as little as humanly possible. And I was there are ways to, if financial stability is what you're after, maybe don't pursue this too hard, this career, because it's very, I mean, there's no stability, there's no regularity, and it's all based on how good you are and how good you can sell yourself. So, um, I don't have any advice for how to get better at selling yourself, other than if you want to work for a band, give them a design, to start off with. I did. It's it's a good way to get your artwork out there, or do it for some nominal fee or free merch or credit or something like that. But um, there is a threat. There's a very difficult uh, crossroads for the artist moving. If you're an artist who's currently working but wants to know how to make it professional, and dedicate your time to that, you have to in my opinion, it's best to maybe have worked enough at that point that you can confidently estimate your own value. It's a very difficult thing to do. I think that one thing artists suffer from, and I suffered from in the early years, was a sense of false humility. Um, at some point, you're going to need to ask for what you feel you are worth, and you need that's not the important thing. I don't really like getting talk about like money and art, because I don't think the two go hand in hand. The best piece of advice I can give to any artist in working in any field at any level is know yourself. Artist, know thyself. You need When you know who you are, or when you simply by asking the question and trying to figure out who you are, you're going to learn more than anyone else is capable of telling you, because people use superlatives like in crazy ways sometimes. That's the best thing I've ever seen. No, it's not. It's literally not the best thing you've ever seen. When I hear that, I'm like, no, that's just what I've done is cannot be the best thing you've ever seen. It's not the best thing I've ever seen. So, uh, when you know yourself, when you take the time to figure out who you are and what you're about and what your intention is, and you need it's a road where you need to ask the most important questions that artists ask themselves, which are the same: who am I? What do I have to lend here? What can I do? And most importantly, if you consider yourself an artist and not necessarily a commercial artist, but if you consider yourself an artist, make the art for you. The trick and the I think the fun thing to do is to figure out where dovetails what you want to do and what you need to do and what your obligation is as an artist, and somebody that can also work for. And I think that's if you can't answer that question, don't make somebody's album cover, because when musicians put what musicians put into creating art and their albums is so deeply personal, that I think the only respectful way to approach that is to approach it as an artist who knows what they want to say and add something to the mix. And this is specifically within working with musicians. But as an artist working for musicians, it can be helpful to know that anecdotally from my experience, most musicians aren't visual artists and don't understand as much as they understand the delicacies and intricacies of their equipment and recording equipment, how pro audio works, how marketing and promoting a record works. In, they don't understand how a strong, confident visual accompaniment to that record can enhance the listening experience. So when I work with musical artists, and I've got to be careful about how to give this advice out as well, but I make sure that very quickly and very upfront that the musicians I'm working with understand that I can't do what they want me to do. And if they need somebody who's going to take art direction or do what they want them to do, I'm happy to give out a list of my friends who I think would be excellent for it, who do take that type of satisfaction, like customer satisfaction seriously. I don't. What I what the way I approach album art, and I think this can be done confidently because I see people do it all the time, is recognize that if somebody's coming to you to work with them an aesthetic piece that goes with or a visual piece that goes with the music, it's your duty to listen to it as a fan, as a responsible artist, as somebody who can not not necessarily listen to what the artist tells you their music is about or what the lyrics explicitly tell you the music is about. But as a visual artist, you need to understand that your strength in this world is in reflecting the non-visual into a visual realm. And so you have to hear what the artist is actually making music about. You have to take the clues that they give you based on the way it makes you feel and find yourself in there such that your imagery or your art that you add to this not just accompanies, not just heightens, but really creates the universe that this bit of audio has mostly populated. But you need to create that universe, and you need to guide other listeners into that universe in the way that it moves you. So if it doesn't, so don't work with bands you don't like or respect or love. Uh, Unless you have to, and that's the simple truth is some people need to take a more commercial aspect to this and take art direction and work where the work is. But it is so much more satisfying to be at this stage in my career and to say that I've only made a few mistakes in that regard, and I've never done it intentionally. I've only taken on projects that I love the music, love the people making it, respected something about it if it was musicians that I didn't know, but I do it all with passion. I do it all with love because the you have to. It's about feeling. Music is about feeling. Art is about feeling. Um, it's not about. It's never ever ever about the first thing you see when you look at it. It's never about the lady with the barbed wire wrapped around her head, you know, being caressed by eels holding two roses in her lap. That's not what the piece is about at all. Those are visual clues that, if you spend enough time with them, begin to hint at the greater meaning. And you need to take. So I think that album artwork is very serious, and I think Roger Dean did a great job because he would do all this stuff for Yes, and I can't find any musical value in Yes. I almost can't stand them as a band, but his artwork made me buy the records.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'd be remiss if we got through this discussion without mentioning Pusshead. Pusshead was hugely influential on me, and I don't shy away from that fact. When I was a kid, and I grew up in the country, and there wasn't a scene, there wasn't concerts, it was just like what kids had on the t-shirts, and so there was these older kids that I would see that would wear Metallica t-shirts. I didn't like metal, when I was young. I liked punk rock, but I saw this. I'd see these kids with these t-shirts, and I'd be like, that I feel something, like what is Metallica like? Like somebody explain this. Somebody tell me what's going on here because this artwork is it has to a kid it's immensely visceral, but there's a style and there's an atmosphere and there's a mood to it that is really important. It's unreplicatable, and as an artist, you just want you're you're only doing you're only creating true art when you're doing something that is individual. If it falls in line with the school of thought, or if it falls in line with the status quo, you're not making art. You're making a product. When when I first started, I'm sorry, I'm making a long answer, but when I first started off in music, I was I had become very like sort of disenfranchised by the imagery and the music that I liked. You know, at that point, I was like, it seems very macho. It seems very muscular and one-sidedly sexual, and you know, submissive women and flames and skulls, and it didn't it didn't seem like imagery that I could relate to. But the I liked the individual things. So when I some of the earlier work that I did, I thought, well, you know, I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if it was like sensuous and beautiful and sublime and quiet in a way that hinted at like a deeper meaning? Or wouldn't it be interesting to just take all these hyperloaded visual this hyperloaded visual language, which heretofore has been highly masculinized and highly, you know, sort of seemingly misogynistic, I think, at times, or overly concerned with death and, you know, just like this really blunt, horrible sexualism. Would it be cool to like just take all that language, all those visual cues, and just turn them somewhere that felt more serious and more, you know, unique? And that's, you know, because that's frankly what I'd seen with Pusshead's work when I was young, was that, yeah, it's like skulls and like these weird ideas of evil, but there was something very personal to it as well. And I felt that, you know, and I was starting in the early 2000s, so everything was, you know, Photoshop was like the
Yeah,
de facto fucking,
it
you
was
know,
everywhere.
it was the status quo of logos and album jackets. But you know, I think also like that like the '90s scene of like Kozik and Coop and, you know, all these like sort of like counterculture juxtaposed artists, like they're sort of like muscle car, hot rod, you know, heart beating out of the chest, ooga ooga eyes, and you know, the big breasted women. I was like, it's we've that is gone, or like we've moved to the side, we've moved laterally. Like we, you know, maybe it is like the duty of some of us as musicians and artists to just like offer a counterpoint, if nothing else, just a different way of expressing similar things, using this, you know, again, using the type of music that I like, heavy music, but putting emotions and feelings into it. That was what I added. You know, that's what I wanted, was something that was deeply personal and deeply like emotional and based on experiences and reflections that I had, but didn't necessarily need to come off as linear or hyper narrative. More like, you know, to where I started. I think I was reading Carl Jung, Man and His Symbols, and I was like, okay, this is what I'm talking about. Like, there's these archetypal images. It is like the human form. It is, you know, it is skulls as a reflection of death, or uh, you know, flora and fauna as like as symbolism. And I was big into like Greek like mythology when I was young, so I really like had a pretty early interest in how an image could mean more than it you know, mean more than just a superficial thing. Like it had me thinking at that level, and then Jung kind of blew that open for me, and I felt all of a sudden I felt comfortable rehashing these images that I, you know, that I felt drawn to making, but didn't quite know why. And I was like, okay, my art could be an investigation of that in those days, and also create maybe something that's just a little off
A little
the
different.
beaten path for people. I mean, it became. I think there was then a period where like you couldn't find a stoner rock record that didn't have like some kind of Art Nouveau thing going on it. So I mean, it was what it was, but it's like, for me, it's the goal is always to find, you know, new discoveries, new avenues where I can use the language that I'm familiar with, and use the language that you know, that my viewers understand, and continue to deepen the context and continue to deepen the meaning of those things as my life goes on. They, you know, these albums take on different meanings for me.
Yeah. No, I I definitely can hear what you're saying, and I think beyond just knowing what you are, in some ways, it's if you don't know what you are yet, figure out what you're not. That's also
Yeah,
kind of helpful.
yeah, for sure. And I think I think when I say figure out who you are, is to try to urge people not to learn so many times over what they're not, because that, I'm a firm believer in like making mistakes as a way to make improvements. I mean, it's the only way. It's a primordial thing. Kid, don't touch that hot stove; you'll get burned. Yeah, but I need to see for myself. Okay, so we do need to see for ourselves. That's what we are. We're artists. We're curious. But as you apply your curiosity, continually use the lessons you learn from that curiosity to better define what you are, and ultimately, hopefully, come out the other end of the meat grinder with something important to say and something meaningful to yourself first. I, when young musicians ask me for a piece of advice, I say write better songs, no matter who you are, because it works. It's always a piece of advice. Just write better
Yeah,
songs. It's a little harder to say like make better art. It's less definable. It's less tangible. So it's all like for visual artists. I think the advice is always learn learn how to use learn that not only are your brushes and your pens and your papers and your paints tools, but your technique is the tool. Your technique is the ultimate tool because it's the thing that takes practice, that then you have to at some point break free from what the technique is in order to use it convincingly and use it in an artistic way. Um, and that's kind of the fun. That's kind of the
yeah,
fun part is discovering that something you didn't think could do one thing is actually really good at that in your hands. That's a element of individuality that I think is worth pursuing.
definitely. Well, John, I really appreciate it. For everybody watching, please, of course, check out Baroness's music, but also follow him on Instagram. He's posting art all the time. That purple print, by the time this uploads, is probably going to be live, so I'm sure it's going to be easy to find online to purchase that. Go ahead.
Uh, and for those who may not know, also, and this was something I just did recently, was I decided for some of my collectors who are feeling a little like it's a lot of money to invest in these sort of high end screen prints and stuff. I've now got a store with Jake Bannon at Death Wish, where you can get some of select images of mine printed out as G clays and apparel and stuff like that. But just wanted to make a place where people didn't feel excluded by the price tag. So there's also that.
Definitely. Sounds good. Well, stay behind just for a minute. Everybody else, new episodes every Thursday. Thank you so much. See ya.